Okay, cool. Well, it looks like we're ready to start here. So thank you for coming to my panel. I am Ben Heckendorn, aka Ben Heck. Oh, thanks. Yay! Former YouTube star in the past. Now I'm just a wandering vagabond, apparently. So so what they asked me to do today in this panel is basically talk about what's inside of video games, or the consoles. They gave me some choice items that I can take apart for you. That's why we have this close-up camera. I'm not actually going to do card tricks. So yeah, I figured we could do that, and I could talk about some of my game history as we go along. And then near the end, we'll take about 15 minutes for questions and answers. So one question I've been getting a lot is, oh look, it's a Sega Genesis. Oh, what's it? Demo. Oh, I thought it was dead. Okay, cool. So one question I've gotten a lot is, why did you stop doing the show? You know, people are like, no, I can't live without your show. And I was like, well, we started it back in 2010, and I got this email from an ad agency in San Francisco, and they're like, hey, we have this client. They want web content, basically, as a way to drive membership to their channel. Would you be interested in making a show? And I was like, yeah, that sounds really cool, because I'd been doing podcasts for years at that point. Of course, I used to love making movies. So, of course, we all know what this is. That's the expansion port for the amazing Sega Cd Rom. So you can play all the cool games. So this screwdriver is not magnetized, which I usually, oh, I know it is. Okay, never mind. Let's see if I can get these out. Oh, yeah. See, I usually don't put things back together. So I think they're playing with fire by giving me these consoles. So they're just going to get back like burning hunks of plastic. So anyway, we started doing meetings in 2010, and they're like, hey, we'd like you to do a web show. And I didn't even really know what the company was. Later I found out it was an electronics manufacturer, distribution company. And I'm like, yeah, that's cool. So we started that up, and it was so long ago, we were on revision 3. Which I'm not even sure if they're around anymore. I think they got bought up by Discovery. And we did that for eight years, 7 seasons, like 7.5 seasons. And it was really cool doing the show. It was a lot of fun, and and I was paid to do it, so that's always good. But it was a real, very stressful, because we weren't just sitting around talking about movies or video games. We were having to build things every week on the show. Well, it was every other week for the first 2 years, but then season 3 to 7, it was every week. That was a lot of deadlines, and it kind of just, very stressful. So that was one of the reasons I was like, well, this has been fun, but I think I need to kind of take a break. Of course, this is your RF shield. Your device cannot create unintended radiation that can affect other devices around it. So this isn't to necessarily protect your device from radiation, it's to protect other devices from this device's possible unintended radiation. Now, in modern devices, like a laptop, they'll often have metallized paint inside of it, so you don't even need these shields, which of course is cheap. It's all about making it as cheap as possible. So this is obviously the first model Sega Genesis. Oh man, so many screws. So I guess the question is, can I take apart these 3 consoles in 30 minutes? Now that's a YouTube channel for you. It's also not very well lit up here, but I know that's what the camera people wanted, so I will deal with it. Okay, am I missing something? Oh, there's more in the back. Oh man, I know the Nintendo is also filled with screws. So we, when I first started my show, it was just me. Basically, I was filming myself, editing. It was actually quite a bit of work. And then, pretty much like, 13 episodes in, they hired Allison to be the camera person. And she also would do the assembly editing. So that gave me more time to work on the projects, which was really cool. And Allison and I are still friends, even after all the crap I put her through. So that's good. Yes. We still all get together and we have bad movie nights. And actually, it was last year here at the show, the guy who sells all the laser discs, he was like, you have to watch this bad movie. And he sells me this DVD of a movie called Tiptoes. where Gary Oldman is a dwarf, apparently. And it's a really, like, misguided bad movie. But Peter Dinklage is in it, and he's awesome. All right, so what am I missing here? So in this panel, I'm just going to struggle with one RF shield. And it's going to be really disappointing for me. Oh, look, they got a tab here. Look at that. Oh, there we go. Oh no, there's one more. Now here's the thing. On a YouTube channel, you can edit the sound. So the real trick with YouTube, or at least with me, is it's not that I'm necessarily super talented. Well, maybe some people think I am, but it looks easy because we edit out all the mistakes. All right, so here we are inside of the Sega Genesis. Amazing. Now, if you look here, we see that they've basically had two options for how to attach what I'm going to assume is the RAM. See here? They have two different things here. So they would do that in manufacturing lot. Basically, if they had the wide dip or the narrow dip, this is a narrow dip. Dip is a dual inline package. Oh man, it is kind of dark. Yes, that is the RAM because, well, you probably can't see it on this webcam, but usually when you want to find RAM, you're going to look for a number at the end of it, which is a multiple of 8, which is the number of bits of RAM. Then there'll be a hyphen and another number. So there's a P-10, and 10 is going to be the speed in nanoseconds with the rise and fall time. So I don't know, those of you familiar, but the Sega Genesis, it had that power-based converter so you could run the Master System games. The power-based converter basically does nothing. Everything that you need for backwards compatibility is already in here. Like here, come on. That angle is not too wonderful. I guess you can kind of see it. I can actually see it better up there than I can on here. Oh, here we go. This will work. Okay, it's got to be creative. Oh, yes, I can. Yeah, lovely. All right, perfect. Okay, so right here, this is one of the greatest CPUs of all time, the Z80, or Z80 as they'd say in England. So this was, basically it was a derivative of the Intel 8080 from 1975. It can execute the same instructions. So basically it was a cheap version of an Intel chip. So Intel's always been expensive. So this thing was everything. It's an 8-bit processor. It was in the Master System. It was in the MSX, the ColecoVision, a variant of it is in the Game Boy. It's in everything. It's really cool. So what they did with this system, the Sega Genesis, is they took the CPU of the Master System and used it as the sound processor. So this chip basically is accessing its own bank of RAM, which I believe is right there. Let me just double check. Just a second. Yeah, I think that's it. Anyway, yeah, so basically this has its own 8K RAM. The Sega Genesis didn't have very much RAM for its audio, which is one of the reasons the voices and the speech was so terrible. Because basically it was using the work RAM left over from the Master System as the audio RAM that would play via the Z80. So basically they're using a Sega Master System inside the Genesis just for sound generation. And then in the Master System mode, basically that gives you your backwards compatibility. Yeah, so this giant thing up here, this is another famous chip. This is a Motorola 68000. This chip, it's a 16-bit chip, but actually internally it's 32 bits, which is really cool. So if Atari had made this system, they would have called it 128 bits. Yeah, so this chip dates back to 1979. It's been around, oh no, I'm gonna wake up a little Susie. This chip's been around forever, and this was actually, well, as many of you probably know, the Sega Genesis is based off of Sega's arcade hardware, and having a Motorola 68000 as a primary CPU and a Z80 as a slave processor / sound processor was a really popular combination. So really, this is very much like an arcade, most arcade systems from the 1980s. Yeah, okay, so what else do we have here? So this is going to be your VDP, this is your video display processor. You can't really see it, but it's kind of weird. This is actually RAM. Can you see those two things standing up? It looks like a resistor bank. It's probably kind of hard to see there. They're like vertical. That's actually the video RAM. So it's not a dip package like down here. I don't know, maybe if I can angle the camera a little bit more. See those two things, those two black bars standing up? Yeah, that's the video RAM. It's so weird. So this thing, let me see if I can remember from memory. It has 64K of work RAM, which is over here. Then it has 64K of video RAM, and then 8K on the Z80. So what is that, 136K of RAM? Which is about half of what the Super Nintendo has. And that's one of the reasons Genesis didn't have as much graphic capability. But the CPU on the Genesis, blast processing, we'd like to make fun of it now, but this thing did blow away the Super Nintendo when it came to speed. Because not only that, the Super Nintendo, well, I guess we'll get to that in a minute. You know what, I'll get to it then. Yeah, so something like this, I have noticed as this system ages, the cartridge slot can start to fail. It's not like the good old days, well, the days with the Nintendo, where you had to blow on it all the time. But these are brass contacts, so there's copper, and so there's going to be some oxidation over the years. So I have found you do need to clean these every so often. And then I'm sure some of you know they make amazing RGB mods for the system now. So this system outputs really nice RGB. It was the composite video circuit that kind of sucked. And that's what we saw back in the day, or even worse, the RF signal, which is just a composite signal that has been modulated to a television frequency with audio headed. Yeah, oh, also, pretty standard Yamaha audio synthesizer over here. So yeah, your Z80 would basically tell that what to do. And then, this one I'm not sure. So I don't know everything about every console. I know it's hard to believe, although I think it's quite easy to believe. So yeah, oh, and well, probably this is a big giant heatsink. So these things had very standard linear linear power regulators in them. So we've got two of them right here. I bet one of them is probably a 7805. Yep, 7805C. Oh, there's two of them. So basically, we have two 5-volt regulators. They're going to take the 9 or 12 volts from the power supply, knock it down to 5 volts, and since it's a linear regulator, that is basically turn it into heat. It's a very wasteful way of doing it. Nowadays, everything is switching and much more advanced. But in this case, hey, if you got enough space for a big chunk of metal, you put the cheapest regulator possible, and then you get your 5 volts. Brilliant. And of course, everything now, we still have 5 volts. Well, most modern things run at 3.3 or 1.8. Yeah. So, a really cool system. This isn't the original version of it. But yeah, it sounds pretty cool inside. Any questions about what's inside the Sega Genesis that you could ask me before we move on to the next console? Oh man, I gotta hurry up. I've only got, you know what? I'm just gonna have to save the questions for later. So I'm just gonna assemble this later. Let's move on to the next console. So I have this thing when I do panels. I never go over. That is like my superpower. My other superpower is, for some reason, I'm really good at like waking up with my hair looking cool. What's left of it. It's like the lamest superhero ever. Okay, obviously this is a Nintendo. Oh no, I hope I don't commingle the screws. Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. So, I don't know, you guys all, what is it, the Gaming Historian? They're a really cool channel, I noticed they're here. So, they had the gaming crash of 1984, where you had all these cheap consoles and all these crappy unlicensed games, and the video game market crashed. So when Nintendo came to America, like Eddie Murphy, they're like, we want to do things... Yes, that's right. All the dad jokes you could ever want. Oh. Was it Mufasa in that movie? It was. Yes. Well, no, I'm thinking of Fresh Prince. I'm sorry. Okay, so this is going to make a mess when I do this. So the thing was, they wanted to make the Nintendo, the American Nintendo, as different from a video game console as possible. They wanted to look at the VCR, because VCR is really popular. That's why it has this awful slot loading tray, which is an engineering fail. The first store, actually no, this was distributed in America through Worlds of Wonder, who made Teddy Ruxpin, that freaky thing that would talk to you. That was like Five Nights at Freddy's, like back in the 80s. It was like, oh boy, more RF shields. But anyway, so they went through Worlds of Wonder because Worlds of Wonder already had the distribution channels at the toy stores. And the toy stores didn't want anything to do with video game consoles, so that's why they made that stupid robot. There was no reason it was basically a Trojan horse. So they could say, oh no, this is a toy. Look, there's a robot. And then toy stores were like, oh, okay, we'll take your Nintendo. But the market was so dire at that point that Nintendo would have had to buy back any unsold inventory from the toy stores. So it's kind of weird to think about Nintendo having to go hat in hand to a store and beg them to stock a product, but That is how torpedoed the video game market was. I should say the video game console market. The computer gaming market never really felt the effects of that. And in certain countries, like in Europe, they didn't really have much of a crash at all. It was mostly an American thing. So yeah, more RF shielding. Lovely. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Famicom Japanese version of this system, but the cartridge just goes right on the top. That's why if you take apart a Nintendo cartridge, it's mostly air, because again, they wanted the cartridge to be big, so it was like a VCR tape and was completely different from an Atari cartridge or ColecoVision cartridge. It was all about making it big, and usually they make things big when it comes to America anyway, because it was big America trucks, blah blah blah. But in this case, it was anything to make it more like a VCR. So this is the part that really sucks with the cartridge slot. So you know how? What? Oh, is this modified to not have that anymore? Oh, well, this apparently has an aftermarket connector on it. So how it worked in the old days, the cartridge would go in at like what, 6 degrees? And then it would go down to lock in place. Nothing back here ever moved. This was completely non-mechanical. So basically, if you picture like some connectors like this, so these are the connectors, the metal connectors. The PCB comes in like this at an angle, right? And then it goes like this. So it's kind of like just having to like slide in there. It's not like direct, constant, like this. Oh yeah, right? You ever get like one of those Hyperkin things? Those cartridges are stuck in there, good. And you have to pull them out. It wasn't like that at all. It was very loosey-goosey. So again, this is aftermarket, but what would happen is one side of it, I believe it was usually the bottom side, would basically, the pins would be pressed down over time, and they no longer make contact. So one thing, I was doing this even back in the 90s, you could actually go through with an X-Acto knife, and if you went through and manually stuck the knife in and kind of lifted each one up, you could reestablish the spring tension and make it work again. Now granted, one of the problems with the Nintendo also was the Lockout Chip, which, that was their copy protection, well, not copy protection method, but basically they're like, if you want to make a game on our Nintendo system, we're going to manufacture it for you. That's why all the cartridges look the same, because Nintendo actually controlled the manufacturing, which is also a way to make more money. And there was the Lockout Chip on the cartridge. So the Lockout Chip was a little microcontroller. And if you wanted to have a Nintendo game, Nintendo manufactured your cartridges, and they put the little microcontroller on each cartridge. And the Nintendo has the same chip. When the system boots up, the CPU is held in a reset state, and those chips talk to each other. And if the chips do not talk to each other correctly, your CPU is held in reset, and you get a flashing color screen because the picture processor doesn't know what to do, right? So yeah. So the reason that's important is because those microcontrollers communicated at a much higher speed than even the main processor on the Nintendo. So those particular pins were even more susceptible to an improper connection. That's why blowing on it, just to add a little bit of conductivity for a few moments, that was enough to get it to boot, and then once it booted, you were okay. So it's just about having the conductivity at the start. Because obviously you go, and then it's going to evaporate quite quickly. So yeah, it's basically a, like a challenge word, like, hey, password. Okay, now you can boot, and then once you do boot, you're good. All right, so yeah, this has got an aftermarket thing on it, so it's throwing me another curveball. Yeah, and this is making horrible. Oh, I bet this goes like this. Yep. Awesome. Oh, this is really cool. See, they completely replaced all of that, so it's just your screen. Oh no. It just goes straight in, and none of that stuff, so that's awesome. So I better remember to put this together the right way, or someone's going to be really mad at me. Okay, so look at how much simpler this is. Of course, it's an older system. Now this is an 8-bit system, of course, and it doesn't use, well, it's basically a 6502, which is the other super popular CPU that was in everything, the Commodore 64, the Apple I, the Apple II, the Atari 800. And this was actually a custom variant of it manufactured by Ricoh, which is actually, wait for it, a Sony company. Dun, dun, dun. Actually, you take apart an Apple II GS, and there's a chip inside of it that says Microsoft and Apple. Because it was Microsoft Basic. Everyone used Microsoft Basic back in the day. Okay, so I hope I remember which, yeah, okay, that's okay. I usually take photos of stuff when I take it apart, so I remember how to put it back together, but my phone is Oh my gosh, we are burning up the time here. You know what I'm going to get stuck doing? I'm going to review some of these consoles after the talk is over. I'll be sitting in the corner with my dunce cap on. Look at how elegant this is. This is so nice. All right, so this is quite simple. 6502, more or less. So 6502 with some shift register logic built in to do the controllers, and also sound processing is on this chip. So one mod that you can do if you have one of these, there's actually, what is there, four channels of audio plus PCM, so technically 5 channels. There's actually 2 pins on here, so you can actually do a stereo mod. You basically just wire up a couple resistors to 2 of these pins, and you can put a stereo output on the back of it, which is kind of cool. You get like the triangle wave in one channel and the PCM in the other. Yeah, right here, this is the chip we were talking about. Another fun mod you can do, if you just remove one pin on this chip, I think it's, well, you can't really tell, but there's one pin, you can either cut it off or desolder it and do it properly, and that causes this pin to basically not hold your CPU in reset, which means it's completely bypassed, and then it makes it easier for your games to boot. So obviously, if you had like Tengen or Color Dreams trying to sell you their unlicensed games, you know, I guess they could have instructions in the book of like, oh, here's how to modify your Nintendo so our unlicensed games will work on it. I mean, that would have worked back then, but obviously, nowadays we're used to hacking consoles, but back then people didn't do it as much. Yeah, so then you've got the CPU, then you've got the PPU, the picture processing unit, and there is also a buffer which separates the buses between the CPU and the PPU, and then not very much RAM. You got 2K of work RAM and then 2K of basically your display RAM. That would hold the pattern tables, your sprite tables. But one thing that was really great about the Nintendo loves to push the cost into the cartridge. So you have this huge bus here, which is very large. I mean, you have 2 separate buses. You have the CPU bus and the picture processing bus. What was good about that is you could actually have more RAM for video. It could be included with the cartridge cost. Of course, that also made the cartridges more expensive. I mean, a lot of people seem to forget there were $50 Nintendo games back in 1990, and one big reason for that is because RAM has a lot of cost. So by having so many signals on the bus, I mean, this was a huge, I mean, this is like twice the size of like a ColecoVision or an Atari, because there was a ton of thing on the cartridges, and that was really good for Nintendo because they had a lot of I/O bandwidth to add things to their cartridges over the years and extend the life of the system. The rest of this is just glue logic, gates, multiplexers, memory addressing, and then these little black guys here these aren't memory, these are basically resistor banks. So instead of having a whole bunch of resistors in a row, you know, like that little resistor guy there, if you need like 8 of one value resistor, you get these resistor banks, and there's a bunch of little legs coming off of it. So basically, one of the legs goes to a common ground, and then the other one are 8 separate resistors, and that gives it the pull up or pull down that you need for your I/O. And obviously, you have the controller ports here. I'm sure there's probably some Nintendo programmers in the audience, or maybe not. Actually, probably not, because they'd be bored to death by this speech. But they use shift registers on the controllers. You know, there's only 3 lines, clock, data, latch. So the programmer would have to actually sit there and like bit bang, like bang, 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 to send the commands out to the controller to send the bits back. And then once again, we have yet another linear regulator. It's another 7805, which is, again, 5 volts, with a nice heat sink. When I first started modding consoles back a million years ago, it feels like, I didn't know what I was doing, and right now I'm just better at lying about it. Yes, self-deprecation will get you everywhere in life. But I would hook up 9-volt batteries to video game consoles, and they'd run for like 45 minutes, and I thought I was super smart for doing that. Yeah, but now I realize more. It's like, oh, it's a 5-volt regulator, which means you need at least 7 volts. So even though the system runs at 5 volts internally, you need to have at least 7.5 volts as your input. Because the regulator has something called a dropout. Basically, if you're spitting out 5, you need at least output voltage plus 2, which would be 7, and they usually made it 9. Oh, one thing about the Nintendo has an AC power supply. So basically it takes your 120 mains, knocks it down to 9 volts, and that's still AC. So there's actually a bridge rectifier on this that takes the alternating current from the jack and turns into direct current. Of course, if you hook in a direct current, it's fine because it doesn't get rectified anyway. So that is one interesting thing. This actually has an AC power input, but not AC like the power, basically a low voltage, but at an alternating current. All right, well, I just made a huge mess here, I think. Oh, there's another console here. Okay, you know what? I think we should okay, so Super Nintendo or Tandy-Color Computer 3.
Super Nintendo.
I think it sounds like Super Nintendo. Yeah, I actually, well, whatever. All right, so this is the expansion port for the infamous Sony PlayStation. Yes, yes. So I famously, worked on that thing and figured out how to get it to work. Oh, see, now if we wouldn't have had the special screwdriver, we would have definitely had to do the Tandy. So on that prototype system that I worked on, it basically had one of these ports as well. So it was only an 8-bit bus between the CPU and the CD Rom, which probably would have been quite the limitation. I think earlier I was talking about the differences between the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, and one of them is the Super Nintendo is a 16-bit system with an 8-bit data bus. Dun, dun, dun. So that's what you call a bottleneck. You might recall if you were gaming or reading magazines in 1991, there was a joke that the Super Nintendo came with a free slow-mo feature. So it basically, for all intents and purposes, has the same CPU as the Apple IIgs, which is basically an 8-bit and 16-bit compatible chip, which makes me kind of wonder if they had considered backwards compatibility at some point in time. And the controllers are actually accessed the exact same way, except for instead of having 8 bits of data, up, down, left, right, select, start, VA, it had 16 bits because you had X, Y, and the shoulder buttons, and then there were just 4 bits that were on the So this one's got some really lovely yellow bromide coloring going on. 8-bit guy could totally clean this up. I've never tried that, actually. I kind of like dingy yellow. Actually, I don't think none of my consoles are really that badly miscolored. All right, so we have screws flying everywhere. You know what? Oh man, there's gonna be screws everywhere. I don't know. Oh yeah. Oh, look at this masterpiece of engineering. Did anyone ever actually use this? I never. No. That's what it was for. Look at that. See? Oh, help me eject my cartridge. I mean, I guess it is technically a lever. It will help out. Oh, does this one have some sort of, okay. Oh, this one has an update in it as well. They're giving me all these non-standard consoles. I'm confused. Oh, crap. It's like, oh man, can I get this done in time? No, oh wow, that's... yeah, maybe we could jump to some questions while I'm doing this and ruining all these consoles. Because we're at 5:30 right now. So, yes, any questions while I unscrew all this plating?
Do you actually need to pop the NES down, the cartridge down? Does that actually do anything?
Sometimes it will work without pushing the cartridge down, but usually doesn't. I mean, so I would say yes. Maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but in my experience, it will work, but not very reliably. Oh, there's a spring here. I'll have to remember to lose that.
So do you have any plans for anything post your show that or you just go back to just day-to-day life?
Hold on a second. Oh, I think I cracked it. Oh, I'm in trouble now. So what I've been doing since the show ended is I've gotten back into basically contract prototyping, which is what I had been doing basically ever since I wrote my book. So I used to be a graphic artist. I got into the video game hacking stuff, and then I wrote the book, and then I'm like, well, I was like, this is a good time to quit my current job because here's a fun tip, which I should have been doing the whole time, is after you unscrew something, put the screws back where they were, so you remember where they go. Yeah. Yeah, so the stuff I've been working on right now isn't probably as exciting as what I was doing on the show. I've been concentrating mostly on doing accessibility controllers for persons with disabilities, which is something I've been doing since 2006, but once I got done with the show, I was finally able to basically take the time and redesign it to be better, because I was always like, this could be better. Oh wow, that came with it. Probably gonna get the bill for this later. Like, you destroyed $300 worth of consoles. Okay. Yes. This is also quite elegant. Can you see that? I hope, yeah, that should show. Okay. Okay, so we have a main CPU here, right? It's driving everything. There's actually 2 picture processing units in the Super Nintendo. It's PPU-1 and PPU-2. Each one of them has 64K of RAM, which is these little guys here. And that gives you 128K of video memory. Then over here we have 128K of work memory for the CPU as well. That's probably one of the reasons that there were so many great RPGs on the Super Nintendo, is because it basically just had a lot more RAM for, oh man, gosh, I'm not sure. So this is a later, well actually this is not a later model, it's a model that has the audio in its own box here, and I'm not sure if I really want to dig that deep in the time that I have. So I guess I'll maybe just explain it. So it was a Sony processor, so very much like the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo had its own coprocessor which acted as sound. So you had the coprocessor, then you also had another DSP which actually did the audio itself. So you had a coprocessor controlling it, then another chip that was doing the, basically creating the audio, and then 64 more K of RAM just for audio. So the thing with the Super Nintendo that was unique is that all of the audio was basically what you would, like samples. That's why it had that unique sound. Like if you wanted a soundtrack in a Super Nintendo game, you would record one version of like a gong or a piano or something, and then the chip would take that sample and play it back at different speeds to create the spectrum of notes in your program. So that's why everything kind of had that kind of like reverbery, echoey sound, like the very Super Nintendo-y sound, because it wasn't really sound synthesis. It was very much like a lot of the, you know, you have like, you know, like how they do VST now, where you basically sample an instrument and then it plays it back in a certain way to create a range of notes. So real instruments basically just played back via hardware control. It gave the Super Nintendo its very unique sound and feel. Yeah, I probably lost a lot of screws along the way. Well, a lot of people would say I have a screw loose, so that's appropriate. Did we lose something? Oh, I thought I heard someone say no. I thought somebody was on fire, maybe. Yeah. Okay. So we have probably about 10 to 15 minutes left as I try to figure some things back together. So yeah. Any more questions or any questions? Red shirt man.
The original Nintendo also had what looked like an expansion port on the back of the board, but I've never seen one that wasn't covered.
On the bottom of the board?
It looked like it. You know that plastic cap that you have for the bottom of the head?
Oh yeah, yeah, totally.
There's
There's an expansion port under it.
Okay.
So remember when I talked about how the Nintendo, well, as some of you may know, the Japanese Nintendo, the Famicom, it was a 60-pin connector, and the American one, or non-Japanese, is 72-pin. So they took the Japanese pin out like this, 60-pin, and they went like this. They moved it that way, right? So make it 72-pin. Most of the pins that would connect to the center of a cartridge went right to the expansion port. So that's one of the reasons why the cartridge is wider. So it's basically address bus, clock lines, phase clock, interrupt. It's basically a bus extension. So if they made something like a floppy disk drive or something for the American market, they could plug it in there.
Did they intend to see, because I mean, like I said, I've never seen one that wasn't covered with plastic. They have to break.
Well, I'm sure, if there would have been a peripheral for it, they would have been like, first you need to break the plastic out of the way. Because, as we all know, it's easy enough to do. And then obviously in the Super Nintendo, it was like a nice little tab. But if you're thinking about it, the plastic you have to break away, that can be done in one piece on the mold. So they can mold it like that. But the little door that breaks away in the Super Nintendo, that's an extra piece to add in. You see what I'm saying? Is that right? This is a separate part of the mold. And then they have to pay someone to stick it in at the factory. That costs like a dime. So they're not going to do it. Versus the Nintendo, you see what I'm getting at? Versus the Nintendo where it's molded in one piece. Well, never mind.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it has these breakouts.
Right. That's part of the mold. So they don't. That's one less piece they have to put in place and mold. It's like just a person putting an extra piece in place, they'd be like, oh, that's a cent of labor, right? Times 50 million, and you're bankrupt. That. Anyway, yes. Okay, Hat Man. No, yeah, you have a hat.
I guess you're right.
I'm Hat Man.
Those little tricks that you kind of said, like flipping up the little connector pieces, do those apply to like the modern day consoles you can buy? Those like combo.
Oh, like an FC Twin.
Yeah,
or,
right. Yeah, and
most of those have really tight connectors, from my experience. But yeah, I mean, basically over time the metal's going to bend back and lose its elasticity. Any sort of connector part, like if you go to an online store and say, oh, I want this USB jack, you read the data sheet and it'll be like, this is only guaranteed to like 10,000 mating cycles. It's not actually that high. So basically everything will fail eventually. So I would say that would apply to the newer systems. Why have you had trouble with one?
no, just like all those tricks, applying to the modern console board. Does some of that go outdated? Like maybe like we don't need to disconnect that one, the copyright connection piece. Like that doesn't apply anymore because they're not worried about that.
Right.
So
Well, there's
some
different
of that
copyright protection.
outdated, right? Some of those tricks to make.
Yeah, well, the consoles are all outdated, so yes, the tricks would be too.
I actually had to bend some pins like that on the AV out port on my PS3, so yes, we can still do that.
Oh yeah, and that's only what, 10 years old? Awesome. Well, cool. Thanks for that information. Yes, sparkly hat thing. Yes.
Yeah. So with all the modding and all the hand-wired computers that you've rebuilt and everything, if you were going to build, the Ben Heck 8 or 16-bit computer, what parts would you put in it? Would you put a 6502? Would you put a Z80?
I'd probably go with the Z80, just because I think it's a little bit more elegant than the 6502, which is blasphemous for me to say since I grew up with Atari 8-bit computers. Yeah, I was actually talking to the 8-bit guy about this about 30 minutes ago, but yeah, probably a Z80. I would love to do something where you make like an LCD controller, like the Tandy under the TRS 80 Model 100 had. To basically, figure out a way to hack the Z80 and actually use low-level logic. A lot of people will use like a microcontroller and FPGA. I would love to do it with just glue logic, and basically, yeah. So I would say probably a Z80, CPM compatible, portable, built-in keyboard, some sort of LCD screen, possibly a composite video output, and then maybe like a compact flash card slot. But I would try to do it without any modern microcontrollers. I love modern microcontrollers, but I like to be pure. Because I'm crazy enough to hand-wire computers, so I'm like, this microcontroller doesn't fit. Yeah. Red Hat Man.
Hey, quick question for you. I watch a lot of the modding on YouTube and other places, and a lot of them just breeze over like this PPU, CPU, and this is what it does, this is the pin, clock, and all that other stuff. Is there any resources that if we're interested in getting into the nuts and bolts of how digital logic and all that stuff works, is there any recommendations like books or videos or anything that we can watch to further knowledge in that? Because I've started to mod consoles lately, as of the last year, and I'm interested in why it works and how it works.
Right. So most of the information you're going to find out is basically like how to hook up to the chips. So you're talking about how the chips actually work internally, right?
Yeah, or how the system or how this console works and why it does what it does.
Have you seen the Monster 6502 or the 6502.org project with like Visual 6502?
I saw a little video from Germany or something.
Right.
They actually took it apart and they were showing how they shaved layers off or whatever to get at the actual schematic or something like that.
Right, so they could actually figure out how it works. Like,
Yeah.
5? Okay. A CPU is, actually it's usually a bunch of layers. So it's almost kind of like 3D printing where they're like in the factory, like putting layer upon layer upon layer. So yeah, you can't just look at it and see everything. Well, at least modern CPUs, you have to like drill it down and find everything. Like you might have like buried transistors and whatnot. So I mean, really, if you think about it, like a CPU is basically, I know it sounds simple, but it's millions of transistors. And the transistors are formed into gates, and those gates basically create the logic functions that give you a CPU. And the CPU basically would have like 255 different opcodes, and those are all built into the hardware. And then the instruction comes across, it sees the code, and then decides what part of the system to operate. Yes, light blue shirt. Yes.
Would it be a good idea?
idea to bend a NES connector on a toaster nest to make it top loaded in any way?
Oh, to bend it? Probably the way to do it would be to make some sort of riser board, like, I don't know if you saw this. See, this is aftermarket. So you could basically come up at an angle, bring this over, and then go up instead of out. So I would say do it with a PCB or an interconnect, and that would be pretty cool. Yes, Mr. Beard. I'm just making up names like on The Office. I'm terrible.
You mentioned that the Super Nintendo's extension port was 8-bit.
Yes, it's an 8-bit data bus along with an IRQ, a few clocks, and a few other things. So if they would have made that CD Rom add-on, it would have been hella slow.
So that's so when you took apart the Sony PlayStation prototype, clearly they were using more than 8 bits to communicate with the extension, like the non-standard parts.
No, that's the interesting part. So yeah, this port existed on that prototype as well. But then inside that prototype, there's a very clear distinction between the Super Nintendo side and the CD-ROM control circuitry. And the connection between those two parts of the circuit, even though it was on one circuit board, was an 8-bit port. So basically, it was one PCB with a Super Nintendo and a CD-ROM controller, which is all that system was. But the communication between those two systems was the same 8-bit port as this, because they would have had to make it compatible with a module that would plug into an existing Super Nintendo. So yeah, you have if you think about how janky the Sega Cd Rom was, that was with two processors, one of them running at 7 megahertz, one of them running at 10 megahertz. They were 16-bit processors, which were 32-bit internally, versus this, which is a single 16-bit processor running at only 3.5 megahertz. That CD-ROM system would have been a dog as far as speed's concerned. That's probably one of the reasons it got killed. Probably like one more question, then I better clean up. Yes, in the back with the glasses.
Oh,
yeah, you have glasses on, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Means mine are working.
So Nintendo and Super Nintendo were known to use mappers to enhance their capabilities. So theoretically speaking, what's the biggest bottleneck to keep a cartridge from being souped up to run like modern?
Probably the amount of power that you can draw through the physical connector itself. We talked about that 7805 regulator earlier. Those are typically probably 800 milliamps, about 1.5 amps. So if you think about this old NMOS technology, this is probably around 700 milliamps, right? So you might have 500 milliamps of overhead left on this regulator. If you put enough things into the cartridge, you could basically overload the regulator and the system would brown out. So that would be basically, yes, the ability to supply power to the cartridge would be the limitation. But I mean, you've probably seen, they don't do it so much for Nintendo, but like the Atari age people, a lot of those homebrew cartridges actually have ARM processors in them that are adding capabilities to the game. So basically, yeah, just power. Okay, cool. Well, I suppose I should wrap it up because I have to clean up my mess. Thank you for coming to the panel, and yeah, enjoy the show.